Hi, welcome. We will be getting started shortly. Thank you. All right, we can go ahead and get started now. So thank you for attending my webinar today. My name is Lacey Waynand. I am a law student and a summer IHL intern here at the American Red Cross. We'll be covering a couple of different topics today, starting with the types of landmines and unexploded ordnance, as well as the application of the four fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, before moving on to the role of international advocacy and actors such as Princess Diana, looking next at international instruments which regulate and prohibit the use of mines, and lastly, the demining processes and other methods to protect civilians. And if we have some time at the end, I can also take some questions from the audience through our Q&A feature. So first, we'll start with a few rounds of fact or fiction. I will go ahead and share some information with you, and you can decide whether or not it's true or it's false by sending it in the chat. So first question, there's a type of mine that will arm when you step on it, and then only detonate when you take your foot off of it. This can allow time to find a heavy object to place on the mine as you remove your foot. What do you think? All right, I'm seeing a couple of chats come in. So this is false. Most mines are often already armed when they are placed, and they are far more sensitive than depicted in the movies, not giving any time at all to react or to find something to replace your foot. Second question, mines are always laid in a predictable pattern to create a barrier. Please send in the chat, true or false. All right, seeing a couple things in the chat already. So that is false. While conventional armies do lay mines in a regular pattern, many minefields do not have a discernible pattern, especially when the minefields result from a civil conflict without clear battle lines. All right, our third question. Mines are relatively cheap to acquire and make, but they're incredibly expensive to remove. True or false? So that is actually true, that according to the UN, mines cost between $3 to $75 to produce and between $300 and $1,000 per mine to clear. And of course, on to our last question. Luckily, landmines do not last very long, and after a few years in the ground, they will disarm, rot, and no longer pose a threat. So, of course, that is false. Most mines remain armed for decades. If it were the case that mines do not last, there would be no reason for today's webinar. However, after being placed, landmines pose a significant threat to civilian populations long after the end of conflicts. So Jody Williams founded the International Campaign to Ban Landmines in 1991, and by 1997, the campaign grew to include over 1,000 organizations in 60 countries. Because of her work, Jody Williams was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997. So this quote comes from her Nobel lecture when she accepted the prize, and it clearly illustrates the foundation of today's webinar. It reads, "The crux of the problem is that while the use of the weapon might be militarily justifiable during the day of the battle, or even the 2 weeks of the battle, or maybe even the 2 months of the battle, once peace is declared, the landmine does not recognize that peace. The landmine is eternally prepared to take victims. In common parlance, it is the perfect soldier, the eternal sentry. The war ends and the landmine goes on killing." So we'll look now to a couple different types of mines. The first kind are anti-personnel mines, and these are the kinds of mines that we tend to think of or that we see in a movie. These are victim activated. They can be placed above, on, or under the ground, and they are triggered either by contact or by proximity. And so this means directly stepping on the mine, but also stepping near the mine, as some of these can be very sensitive, and indirect pressure could be enough to set it off. They can also be placed by hand, scattered by aircrafts, rockets, artillery, or even on vehicles. These mines are very cheap to produce, as I mentioned before, and they can cost between $3 to $75 to make, but between $300 and $1,000 per mine to remove. We'll next look at anti-vehicle mines. These mines are not unlawful under the Ottawa Convention, but they cannot contain an anti-handling device, which would prevent someone from removing the mine and disarming it. The restriction on anti-handling devices arises from Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. These mines also tend to be larger, and they've historically been used alongside anti-personnel mines. And last, we have unexploded ordnance, also known as explosive remnants of war. So unexploded ordnance and explosive remnants of war are constituted by any explosive remnants left over after a war. So these can be cluster munitions, submunitions, artillery shells, grenades, rockets, mortars, basically anything an armed force may leave when moving between areas of conflict or used during an attack. They are extremely unstable and they may detonate at any time without even direct pressure or close proximity. So although there are many differences between these mines, such as their sizes, there are also a few common characteristics between these mines and these explosive remnants of war. The first is that they tend not to have a self-neutralization or self-destruction mechanism. Also referred to as dumb mines, once placed, they will continue to pose a threat until demined or triggered. Now, this isn't to say that all mines are designed to be dumb. Some models do include a self-neutralization or self-destruction mechanism. However, these mechanisms tend not to be very reliable, and they still allow the mines to remain armed and volatile. Mines and unexploded ordnance are often protected by a metal or plastic shell, making them waterproof. These protective shells allows the mines and unexploded ordnance to last for decades, and to continue to cause severe harm to civilians long after the end of conflict. And as I mentioned previously, most often there is no clear or predictable patterns for the placement of these mines. This is especially true for unexploded ordnance and explosive remnants of war because of how randomly they're scattered across battlefields. This makes it incredibly difficult and dangerous for communities that were displaced from a conflict when they return home because it isn't always clear where the danger lies. And in some cases, even if there is a predictable pattern, or when extensive resources have gone into mapping a region, these identified locations can shift after weather events and render the mapping useless. So we'll look now towards the history of the mines and their early forms. The earliest widespread documented use occurred during the Civil War, and they were mainly used for defensive purposes and to protect troop positions. Mines were then used broadly during World War I against tanks, and the advancement in the technology protecting tanks led to increased anti-personnel usage. Thus, as the value of anti-vehicle mines decreased, the use of anti-personnel mines increased. Moving now into the post-war but pre-convention context, millions of mines have been laid in countries such as Cambodia, Vietnam, Angola, and Afghanistan during decades of unrest and armed conflicts. Mines were transitioned from being a purely defensive weapon to an offensive weapon, contributing to their widespread usage. By the time of the 1980s, 80 countries were still contaminated by more than 70 to 100 million mines. So, why care in 2024? Well, mines still contaminate 60 countries across the globe. Approximately 5,000 people are killed or maimed annually, and children comprise half of that figure. Often these children were simply walking to school or playing outside when the mines were triggered. And many of these injuries result from mines that were placed before the children were even born, forcing them to grow up in fear from the shadow of a conflict that they never experienced. And in addition to half of the injuries being inflicted upon children, approximately 85% of those deaths are civilians. So this map was developed by the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, Landmine and Cluster Munition Monitor Project, which is a civil society initiative for providing research to the ICBL. It illustrates how widespread the contamination of landmines are and which countries are most heavily impacted by the presence of mines. Similarly, this map illustrates contamination by cluster munitions and their broad use. As I mentioned, cluster munitions are highly unstable and are often spread without clear regard for civilian populations or without a plan to demine after the conflict. So we'll turn now to looking at some of the long-term impacts of landmines. First, civilians maimed by mines often must undergo amputations to save their lives and thus lose their limbs. This loss contributes to potential loss of autonomy for these individuals and a loss of economic opportunities. The loss of a limb and autonomy also comes with cultural stigma, as survivors describe being seen as a burden, as sick or unemployable, and in some cultures, even as punished for their sins. There are also significant financial consequences after encountering a mine, including the high cost of medical care and post-amputation therapy. And last, the country as a whole also experiences potential stagnation in development, because the mine land cannot be utilized for agricultural activities or any post-war construction and development. One of the driving motivations for demining regions post-conflict is to assist with their economic growth and development. And in many instances, villages that were contaminated by mines appear frozen in time and even deserted, as the difficulties with rebuilding a community post-conflict are exacerbated by mine and explosive remnants of war contamination. So, how does international humanitarian law apply? Well, we'll first recall our 4 fundamental principles. The first is distinction, which requires that parties to the conflict must be able to distinguish between civilians and combatants and civilian and military objects. Next, we have proportionality, which requires that the harm to civilians and civilian property cannot be excessive when weighed against the anticipated military advantage of an attack. We next have military necessity, which requires that any military action must achieve a legitimate military purpose and must weaken the military capacity of the other parties to the conflict. And last, we have the prevention of unnecessary suffering, and this asserts that the means and methods of warfare must not be designed or calculated to cause unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury. This applies specifically to combatants and has been interpreted to mean any suffering that has no military purpose or does not achieve a legitimate military objective. So we'll now apply these 4 fundamental principles of IHL onto landmines and the humanitarian concerns that comes with using them in combat. So first, with distinction, landmines cannot, and they do not, distinguish between a combatant and a civilian, and they especially cannot and do not distinguish between wartime and between peacetime. Next, with proportionality, although during a conflict, mines may be proportional at the time they're placed, once the armed forces have moved or the hostilities have ceased, the resulting harm is nearly entirely experienced by civilians and children. When viewed along with the statistic that 85% of deaths and maimings are civilians, it becomes clear that mines cannot comply with proportionality. Now, military necessity. This was and continues to be a significant reason why states were reluctant to entirely ban these weapons and destroy their stockpiles. Mines are very useful for militaries. There are entire theories of war dedicated to the best utilization of mines and how to calculate their emplacement. However, with the prevention of unnecessary suffering, it is clear that mines are calculated to cause excessive and superfluous injuries, and that many designs have been conceived to severely maim an individual without outright killing them. And so much of the success of the international campaign to ban landmines was due to their unrelenting advocacy for a mine-free world and one simple call to action: a total prohibition on landmines. Rather than negotiate for acceptable uses of mines and limitations on technological advancement, the total prohibition removed military necessity out of the equation entirely. This focused the international discussions on the adverse impacts of the mines and the excessive harm they cause civilians. It was an entirely humanitarian argument, and as we can see now, a clearly successful one. The advocacy for a total prohibition was an international movement comprised of many organizations such as these. For instance, the Halo Trust is the group famously visited by Princess Diana in Angola, which works to clear minefields, educate on the risks of mines and methods to be safe, and assist governments in securing and destroying their munition stockpiles. The Halo Trust also works with governments to mark and register their weapons to reduce potential future harm. UNMAS stands for the United Nations Mine Action Service, which leads, coordinates, and implements programs across the world to mitigate the threat and harm posed by landmines and unexploded ordnance. MAG stands for the Mine Advisory Group, which, similar to the Halo Trust, works to clear landmines and cluster munitions, educate on the risk and demining activities, assist governments in securing and destroying stockpiles, and they campaign for further civilian protections and assistance. And last, the international campaign to ban landmines has worked for decades now to eradicate landmines and advocate for the rights of survivors and communities impacted by landmines. But, of course, the most famous face of the movement was Princess Diana. She visited Angola in January of 1997 and completed her famous mine walk then to raise awareness. She was reportedly moved to act after meeting with local adults and children from the community who had lost limbs because of their encounters with landmines. At the time of Princess Diana's visit, the country was contaminated by over 15 million mines. The country was, and still is, one of the most heavily mined places. Additionally, at the time of her visit, 1 in every 330 people had lost a limb because of a mine-related injury. The following August, Princess Diana traveled to Bosnia to continue her advocacy. It was there that she called for a total prohibition on the use of mines and increased funding for survivors of mines and explosive remnants of war. At the time of her visit, an estimated 600,000 to 1 million landmines and explosive remnants of war were scattered across the country. Sadly, Princess Diana never got to see the culmination of her work as she passed in late August. Yet, in response to the pressure she was able to put on the situation, the international community adopted the Ottawa Convention in September of 1997. The Ottawa Convention is short for the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and the Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines and on their destruction. Signing of the convention began in the following December in Ottawa, Canada, and the convention entered into force in March 1999. Since then, more than 55 million mines have been destroyed in approximately 90 countries as of 2023. Prince Harry has also taken up his mother's work by visiting Angola in 2019. He completed his own mine walk during his visit and advocated for continuing commitment to a mine-free world. So I also have this video here which demonstrates the impact that Princess Diana had and the role that Prince Harry has now taken on to continue her advocacy.
In January of 1997, landmines were the furthest thing from our brains. We were getting ready for the inauguration of Bill Clinton's second term. We were wrapped up in our own domestic politics. It seized every channel of news in the United States. And it was, just such a riveting presence to see the most famous woman in the world in one of the most dangerous places on the planet. As somebody who works for Halo, as someone who's donned that same body armor that she wore on that day and has taken a step into a minefield and felt that terror and trepidation for the first time, I am sure that it was terrifying for her. But I know that she understood the importance of her taking that step, understood that she could bring this issue to a world stage. Diana's walk through that minefield mobilized the entire international community around this tragic threat. And as a result, most of the minefields that we were dealing with in 1997 are gone, and we owe that all to her. And now that legacy is being carried on with her son. When I went back to Huambo in 2019 to witness Prince Harry making that historic walk, retracing his mother's footsteps, the transformation was powerful and shocking. Often noticing the school and the hospital that had been built on that land that had been cleared, all of that absence was now present with life and with joy of school children lined up in their white uniforms, cheering and singing to Harry on the sidelines. A place that was nothing but death and danger, now this vibrant urban city in the second largest city in Angola, and all of that made possible by his mother's sacrifice, her vision. And Harry picking up the baton, him making that walk as a tribute to her, but as a reminder to all the rest of us that there's more work to be done.
Well, to walk in her footsteps is clearly quite emotional for me. But I think as much as she did then, there is still so much to do. But without question, if she hadn't have campaigned the way that she did, this could arguably still be a minefield. So I'm incredibly proud of what she's been able to do, and meet these kids here who were born on this street, who actually didn't even know that this was a minefield.
So after the convention, the Halo Trust has cleared almost 100,000 mines in Angola. Women comprise a large number of deminers, making up almost 40% of MAG's personnel. The Halo Trust 100 Women Project has created demining groups entirely made up by women as well. And in 2018, the project completed the first demining of a field started and finished entirely by women. Now in Bosnia, MAG reports that as of 2024, they were able to destroy more than 3,000 mines and explosive remnants of war. MAG has also cleared over 190 acres in areas of rough terrain with their mechanical demining equipment. So what is the Ottawa Convention? Well, as I mentioned before, the official title is the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines and on their destruction. So we'll turn now to looking at a few key articles of the Convention to understand the obligations that states have imposed on themselves. Article 1 first describes the general obligations of the Convention. Each state party undertakes never to use anti-personnel mines, to develop, produce, or otherwise acquire, stockpile, retain, or transfer anti-personnel mines. They also undertake never to assist, encourage, or induce any parties to use, develop, or stockpile mines. Article 4 mandates that all stockpiled anti-personnel mines must be destroyed by state parties, including any mines within its jurisdiction or control. The biggest obligation imposed on states is housed in Article 5, which ensures the destruction of anti-personnel mines in mined areas within the jurisdiction or control of state parties. Article 5 also mandates states to identify known or suspected mined areas and ensure the fields are perimeter marked, monitored, and protected by fencing and other means. Last, if a state party believes it will be unable to destroy or ensure the destruction of all anti-personnel mines within 10 years of the convention entering into force, it may submit a request for an extension of that deadline. Notably, Article 6 requires that each state party in a position to do so shall provide assistance for the care and rehabilitation and social and economic reintegration of mine victims and for mine awareness programs. To see how the convention has worked in practice, we'll first look at Chad, The 1973 Libyan invasion and decades-long internal armed conflicts contributed to widespread anti-personnel and explosive remnants of war contamination. Under Article 5, Chad has been granted 4 extensions to the demining deadline and has requested a 5th due to insufficient funding for demining operations and for victim assistance. Looking now to the other side of the world, landmines were laid along the border of Chile during the 1970s Pinochet regime. Chile has met its Article 5 anti-personnel mine clearance obligations in 2020. The country also passed a reparations system in 2018 to support victims of mines and explosive remnants of war. Yet, because the country is still contaminated by cluster munitions, one type of explosive remnants of war, many humanitarian organizations have continued to operate in Chile to ensure the total removal of these explosive remnants of war. Zooming back out a little bit again, there are 164 state parties to date of the Ottawa Convention. As of 2023, 94 state parties have destroyed their anti-personnel stockpiles per Article 1 of the Convention. 30 state parties have declared completion of their Article 5 obligations, and 33 states are currently implementing measures to fulfill their Article 5 obligations. And so we can see here with this map the widespread adoption of the Ottawa Convention and all 164 parties to date. But of course, there is an exception. So even though we are not party to the convention, the United States have imposed restrictions on the use and stockpiling of anti-personnel mines. The Biden-Harris administration released a new anti-personnel mine policy effective January 2022, which aligns U.S. policy with key provisions of the Ottawa Convention for all activities outside of the Korean Peninsula. The United States has undertaken not to develop, produce, or acquire anti-personnel mines, aligning policy with Article 1 of the Convention. The U.S. has undertaken not to export or transfer anti-personnel mines, except when necessary for removal and destruction, which aligns with Article 3. The U.S. has also undertaken to destroy all anti-personnel stockpiles not required for defense of the Korean Peninsula, aligning with Article 4. And last, the U.S. will not use anti-personnel mines outside of the Korean Peninsula. So the Korean Peninsula is what's known as the Korea exception in the U.S. anti-personnel landmine policy, that the unique security situation on the peninsula is cited as one of the motivations behind the U.S. decision not to fully sign onto the Ottawa Convention. Landmine use by the Republic of Korea constitutes a significant deterrent barrier on the peninsula, and the defense obligations that the U.S. has undertaken for the Republic of Korea would be negatively affected by the obligations of the Ottawa Convention. This is not to say, however, that the United States does not contribute to global demining operations. Since 1993, the U.S. has invested more than $4.6 billion in more than 100 countries to assist in demining and mitigating the threat of landmines and explosive remnants of war. Additionally, in fiscal year 2023, the U.S. invested more than $348 million in conventional weapons destructions in 82 countries. Additionally, over 71,000 people have received survivors' assistance. According to the U.S. anti-personnel mine policy, these funds support mine risk education to prevent accidents and provide prosthetics, physical rehabilitation services, and vocational training for the injured. And last, more than 47,000 acres were cleared and released back to communities for their use. These acres can now be used to build homes or schools and hospitals, or even developed into agricultural fields and roadways. So, given the widespread contamination of landmines, states and non-governmental organizations have come to develop many techniques and processes for demining fields, other than just simply triggering an explosion. Manual demining is done by utilizing metal detectors or mine detection dogs to ascertain the precise location of the mines before using excavation tools to dig them out for collection and destruction. This is a lengthy process, however, and very dangerous for the individual deminers. Organizations have also been employing larger mechanical demining operations using specialized armored vehicles to clear large swaths of vegetation to find and destroy the mines. The specific terrain of the mine field, however, determines whether demining operations can be done using this equipment, or whether it's so difficult that groups must bring in individual deminers to do it by hand. But these organizations often hire members of the local community to assist in the demining projects. This is done for two main reasons. The first is that local community members are far more aware of the locations of mines and the extent to which the fields are contaminated. Assistance from the community provides these groups with vital firsthand knowledge of the situation. The second reason is that it provides economic opportunities in communities that have struggled to develop after the end of a conflict and provides extensive opportunities for women. Many women view these demining operations as directly helping their children and their families, and overall contributing to the healing of their countries. In addition to active demining, there are other methods that states can implement to protect civilians living in mined areas. As required by the Ottawa Convention, states must identify and mark areas that are known or suspected to have mines. This includes placing warning signs or flags near the location of individual mines, setting up fencing around entire mine fields, or creating and distributing maps of mine locations to educate civilians on safe pathways through mine fields. There is also a proposed UN fund to further assist victims of landmines and unexploded ordnance. This funding provides access for mine risk education, as well as funding for demining operations and reducing the physical and psychological implications of civilian injuries. And although many countries and organizations have undergone the process to demine, there are many difficulties that these operations face. For instance, the demining process can be quite lengthy because it takes a lot of time and care to ensure that previously mined fields are fully cleared of contamination before releasing them back for use. The demining process also comes with high costs, both financially and operationally. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, demining activities require significant funding, given the technical expertise required to demine fields and the cost of equipment and protective gear. Every deminer entering a minefield is also very aware of the cost of their own lives and the high risk that they're taking by helping their communities and their countries heal after a conflict. And as I mentioned before, the type of terrain determines the method of demining. So in certain areas, it is extremely difficult to utilize mechanical demining equipment, and certain types of rugged terrain thus require manual demining instead. Additionally, some communities prefer manual demining over mechanical equipment to protect the natural landscape. Rather than removing vegetation from large swaths of land to find the mines, manual demining ensures that the overall biodiversity is maintained and that mine fields aren't destroyed because of the demining process. And last, climate change poses a significant difficulty for demining operations. To start, extreme weather events and high temperatures make it very challenging to conduct demining operations in certain regions. Any ongoing demining operations also must stop if it becomes too dangerous for personnel in the field. Similarly, rising temperatures can also make the mines more unstable and volatile, potentially causing them to detonate without even the requirement of a direct pressure or close proximity. So now that we've reached the end of the presentation, I'd like to leave you just with a few key takeaways to keep in mind. So even prohibited, mines are still being used broadly in current active armed conflicts, and their effects will impact civilians for years to come, even if peace agreements are reached. And so because of that, demining operations should not be an afterthought. Governments utilizing mines should be pressured to create demining plans and to set aside funds for such operations and for survivors if they decide to place mines indiscriminately during conflict. But the situation isn't hopeless. Since ratification of the Ottawa Convention, annual casualties have dropped from approximately 25,000 in 1997 to 5,000 in 2023. This demonstrates that international advocacy can truly reshape large state actor behavior and have a direct, immediate, and positive effect on people's lives. In countless communities now, children can walk to school and play outside, or adults can pursue economic opportunities, including reclaiming their homes and their lands, without fear of losing their lives or their limbs. The Landmine-Free 2025 commitment arose from the 2014 review of the Ottawa Convention, when every state party to the treaty signed a resolution pledging to demine the world by 2025. It was recognized then that this was an ambitious goal, and we are not on track to reach it. But having the pledge is a symbol that's very moving, and it indicates the commitment of states and non-governmental organizations to protect civilians from harm. Hopefully, with continued advocacy, we'll eventually see a mine-free world. Every mine cleared is a life saved. Thank you for watching. For more information, please use this QR code to visit the American Red Cross International Humanitarian Law website. I will now stop sharing and take some questions.
Hi, Lacey. Wonderful job, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us today. I'm not seeing any questions at that time. If for any reason I'm missing your question, please put it in the Q&A chat. All right. Well, one just came in. Would you be able to tell us, do national societies or the ICRC or anything that involves the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, do they play any role in the demining process at all?
Yes, so the ICRC does play a role in the demining process. They currently operate in several countries across the world to help with demining operations, as well as providing medical assistance to survivors of landmines. Within the Ottawa Convention as well, there is a key provision that suggests that funds that are used to assist victims of mines can be processed by the national societies and by the ICRC.
All right, thank you for that. We do have a question that came in the chat. How are the remnants of removed deactivated mines disposed of? Are they destroyed? And then the question goes on to say possibly materials recycled for good.
Yeah, so the explosive remnants of war, they are destroyed after they are cleared to prevent any further harm. However, some of these explosive remnants of war, as well as landmines, they are sometimes kept, and sometimes the stockpiles aren't entirely destroyed in order to assist with training programs. And so this helps with this mine education and demining process and this operations that they can set up these kind of safer operations to train people and train local community members on how to demine these areas.
All right, thank you for that. Are there any major countries of concern that maybe you didn't explain during your case studies that people should be aware of and possibly look into learning more about?
A few countries do come to mind. A lot of countries at the tail end that have experienced severe internal armed conflicts are heavily mined, and they're these countries that tend to be less developed and that tend not to have as much support from the international community, as well as currently in Ukraine, the situation there, it's becoming one of the most mined areas on the country. I believe in 2023, it had the second most number of casualties because of mine instances. And so a large part of this awareness and the point of this webinar is to keep up the awareness and to keep up the momentum and the advocacy that the convention had such a direct impact because of the pressure that was put on by the international community. And so even now in 2024, we're still facing the long-term impacts of these landmines. And so just continuing to keep up that pressure and continuing to keep up that awareness.
All right, and then one more. Who monitors countries participating in the Ottawa Convention? Like who monitors the compliance?
Yeah, so the Ottawa Convention, it stipulates that annually countries have to submit a report that details the current situation of the landmines. And so the current status of mined fields, the measures that are implemented to demine these fields and the operations that are currently ongoing, as well as the methods that they're utilizing to help survivors and to assist the survivors of landmines. And so every state party to the convention submits their own annual reports, and those are reviewed every time all the state parties come together to review the Ottawa Convention. And I believe the next one is in November of next year.
What is the actions taken if someone's found to be in violation? Like, let's say a country's not following what they agreed to.
Yeah, of course. I'm not entirely sure that answer. That's not something I came across in my research. Many of these countries are actively trying to demine their regions and trying to protect civilians.
All right. One thing I'll add is to that is that sometimes when we think about how to address violations, we think only about like retributive punishments like fines or something like that, but it also could be something as reputational damage, withholding of maybe aid or assistance in other ways if people are found to be in violation. The next question is, does NATO help with clearing mines in any way?
I'm not sure of that answer. I'm sorry, I also did not come across it in the research. A lot of it is driven by non-governmental organizations, unless Christian,
I mean, NATO and their operations, depending on where they're operating, might assist with the demining process, depending on where they're working, or they might set up joint task initiatives with affected countries to assist and train those who are doing the demining process. They might set up NATO-sponsored funds that support, I guess, the activities of the demining process. Maybe they don't have NATO personnel on the ground as well, but that's a few ways that they assist with it, from what I know. All right. Well, thank you again, Lacey, so much. For all of those you are interested in learning more about our IHL program, please visit www.redcross.org/IHL. And you can also find this recording and many other recordings on our YouTube channel, which you can find on that website as well. Thank you so much.